Hey y'all, this is the Iliad Book 24 guided notes. Again, as always, I highly encourage you to take notes along with the video as you are listening and watching. It's really important that you get this information down and that you know what is happening with this because, of course, this is information you're going to be tested on. So good notes are a really important part of watching the video. All right, let's go ahead and begin. So before we start talking about book 24, we need to talk a little bit about the context of what's happened in between book 22 and book 24. So if you recall, book 22 ends with the death of Hector. Achilles kills him and basically spears holes in his ankles and is dragging him around the city of Troy behind his chariot. He's absolutely desecrating the body, which of course again is a huge insult. And I hope you've seen sort of the mindset of Achilles through the notes that you did over chapter 5, Berserk. So anyways, book 23 revolves entirely around Patroclus' funeral. You see here a pretty detailed, incredible painting of the funeral. It's a huge funeral because Achilles absolutely loved Patroclus, and so he makes a really big deal out of his death. One important thing that happens, and you'll see it depicted in the painting, is that Achilles, during his berserk state, he captures 12 Trojans alive and sends them back with Greek soldiers to keep them captive. During Patroclus' funeral, he actually sacrifices them as, again, a blood offering as a way to memorialize Patroclus, as a way to get justice for him. So he does that as well. Patroclus' formal funeral ends, and then we get the second part, which is another part of Greek tradition, and we have the funeral games. So book 23 is mostly made up of descriptions of athletic contests, races, feats of strength, all sorts of stuff like that. And it's almost a strange departure from the war that we've seen, and now it's like they're doing sporting events. And that's what happens. Then we get to book 24. And so before we start diving into really what's the most important part, we need to talk about the beginning of the book. So again, Achilles has been dragging Hector's body around Patroclus' tomb 3 times a day. So he straps the body back up to the chariot, drags him around once, twice, 3 times. Still, he's trying to mutilate Hector's corpse. The gods do not want this to happen. And so the god Apollo somehow magically prevents Hector's corpse from being destroyed. So it doesn't start rotting, it doesn't start sinking at all, it's not damaged at all when Achilles is dragging it around. And Apollo does that because he loves Hector. So as this happens, as the 9 days of the grieving process for Patroclus go on, the gods start debating about what needs to happen. They really do not like Achilles dragging around Hector's body. So Apollo finally convinces Zeus to let King Priam from Troy, Hector's father, to go get the body from Achilles. So he agrees. Zeus also tells Thetis, Achilles' mother, to tell Achilles to let Priam get the body safely. Another thing happens. Zeus instructs the goddess Iris, who is responsible in some parts for dreams, to go tell Priam to go get the body. And then Zeus instructs Hermes, who is the god of messengers and travel and caravans, among a bunch of other things, to transport Priam safely from the city of Troy into the Greek camp to Achilles. And so Priam is told by Iris, hey, you need to go get the body. Zeus is going to help you go get the body. And of course he says that there's nothing else I would want to do. Even if Achilles kills me, this is worth it. Hecuba, of course, thinks this is a terrible idea, but Priam goes anyway. So Priam rides over in a cart to the Greek camp. He's only accompanied by one other Trojan. The god Hermes disguises himself and brings Priam basically from just outside the city to Achilles' tent. Priam runs into Achilles' tent, and notice the physical posture that he takes. He kneels down, he grabs Achilles' knees, and he kisses his Achilles' hands. And so, of course, Achilles is shocked. The people in Achilles' tent are shocked. What on earth is Priam doing here, and why is he doing this? Think about the emotional things that are happening here. Achilles is still grieving Patroclus. Priam comes in, and of course Priam is grieving Hector. So it's a pretty tense, pretty emotional moment. And then you see this old man, this old king kneeling down before Achilles, the very person who has killed his son. It's pretty moving. So Priam immediately begins talking to Achilles, and he tells Achilles to remember your own father. He uses that language, remember your own father. And of course, Achilles' father's name is Peleus. And so Peleus is old like Priam. He says, hey, your father's old like me. Then he goes on to say, Peleus doesn't have sons around him to protect him. And then Priam mentions like, oh, you've killed a ton of my sons. I don't have any sons around me to protect me anymore. And so he's trying to get Achilles to relate Priam to his own father, Peleus. And then he says, Peleus at least knows that he has one son that's alive. He has the son that he has Achilles, that he has you. You're alive to still protect him. But Peleus says, my favorite son, the best son of all, is now dead, and I don't have him anymore. So Priam kisses Achilles' hands. And this is a huge moment because you have to remember, for the Greeks, they are duty bound by culture to avenge deaths of loved ones. Priam has a duty to kill Achilles, but he goes in and he's pleading, and he's begging, and he's kissing his hands. This is incredibly humbling for Priam to do, but he is that devastated about Hector's death. He wants Hector's body back that much that he's willing to humble himself so drastically and cry and kneel in front of Achilles. Then we get what I think is probably the most emotionally moving passage in the entire epic, all 24 books of it, 900 pages. I'm going to read it verbatim because it's that good. It says, those words stirred within Achilles a deep desire to grieve for his own father. Taking the old man's hand, he gently moved him back, and overpowered by memory, both men gave way to grief. Priam wept freely for man-killing Hector, throbbing, crouching before Achilles' feet, as Achilles wept himself, now for his father, now for Patroclus once again, and their sobbing rose and fell throughout the house. That's an incredibly moving scene. You think about these two men who really have been fighting each other for a decade now, and they're sitting there weeping and crying with each other because of what's lost, because of what can never get back, what they can never get back. Priam can never get his son back, and this shows the humanity of Achilles. Of course, he's grieving for Patroclus. It's going back to that whole idea of philos. That loss of his special comrade is still deeply affecting Achilles. But it also mentions that he's grieving for his father, for Peleus. And so I want to remind you the prophecy about Achilles. Achilles could either go home, not fight in the war, and live for a long time and be forgotten. Or he could go to the war, die at Troy, live only a short time, but be the most famous person at the Trojan War. Of course, by this point, Achilles has chosen. He's going to stay at Troy. He's going to stay in the war. He's going to die young, but he's going to get glory. And so in his mind right now, he's grieving for Patroclus. Priam has just told him, hey, think of your father when you look at me. Think of Peleus. Achilles thinks to himself, Peleus is not going to have me in his old age. I am going to die here. And so he's weeping, thinking to himself, my father will be just like Priam one day. My father will be weeping because I will never go home. So it's a very emotional scene, very moving. Achilles then begins discussing fate. He says that Zeus has two jars, and the jars are filled with two different gifts, two different types of gifts. One jar has good gifts, and the other jar has bad gifts, and Zeus gives those gifts to human beings however he pleases. And so again, it's this idea that human beings are below the gods. Okay? Human beings are small compared to the gods. Human beings cannot control their environment. There is so little in the world that humans can control. And so Achilles tells this to Priam, and he sees Priam crying, and he says, "Tears are never going to bring back your son. Fate has taken him away. The gods have engineered things to take away Hector, and tears are never going to bring him back." So then Priam basically assumes that Achilles isn't going to want to harm him anymore. And this assumption angers Achilles, and so we get a little flash of almost that berserk state back, and he warns him. And then Achilles leaves the room, and he tells the servants to prepare Hector's body. He's calmed back down. Achilles enters back in the room, and Priam is prostrated on the ground. He's kneeling on the ground, lying on the ground, and he's crying again. He's weeping. So Achilles then picks him up, helps him up to his feet, and he says, "Priam, you need to eat. Priam, you have to have food. Even though you grieve, you have to have food." And that's a big moment. Eating, telling Priam you have to eat, that's a sign that Achilles isn't in the berserk state. Someone who's in the berserk state doesn't give a rip about the person next to them that needs to take care of themselves, that needs to eat. Eating is also a really intimate activity, right? You choose to eat with, when you're choosing to eat with people, you typically choose the people that you are close with. It is a very close thing to do with someone, so it's intimate in that way as well. And finally, eating is also a very normal activity. We see Priam, he's this great king who's had hundreds of sons, and he's led the Trojan people for years. And then we have Achilles, he's godlike, he's a hero. He's larger than life, he's killed hundreds and hundreds of people. And here they are just eating. And it shows both of these men, after they're able to grieve together about loss, it's so humanizing to see them after 24 books in this epic just sitting there eating with each other. And so they eat. Finally, their meal finishes, and Achilles actually serves Priam the food. But their meal finishes, and Achilles gives Priam a cot that he can sleep on. And so he falls asleep. However, before he falls asleep, Achilles does say, "Priam, I promise that we'll have a truce and the Trojans can bury Hector, and they'll be able to get everything that they need." Okay. So book 24 in the Iliad itself, and with this, Priam goes back home in the middle of the night. One of his daughters, her name is Cassandra, we'll talk about her during the post-war notes, but she sees Priam bringing Hector's body back, and so she starts wailing. The city wakes up, they all run out to see Hector's body, they bring him back in, and the city mourns. They go get the supplies for his funeral, the timber and all of that. They build a pier, or a pyre rather, and then they burn his body and they bury him. And that is how the Iliad ends, with them burying him. Of course, we still have much more to talk about with the war, and we will get there. But for the end of book 24, things you need to know, make sure you're able to discuss fatherhood, right? That whole discussion, Priam and Peleus, and the effect that has there. And in a similar vein, talk about how Achilles, be able to talk about and discuss how Achilles and Priam grieve with each other. Be able to talk about Achilles' discussion of fate, how human beings are below the gods and how there's things outside of their control. And then finally, you need to be able to discuss how Achilles shows humanity as well. It's a major factor. So make sure you take part in the discussion post. There is going to be a keyword for the discussion post, or a key phrase rather. That phrase is, "I am tired of making videos."